What happens when a person thinks they can abuse their power without consequences? Imagine a racist landlord who thinks he can get away with anything until the truth comes back to haunt him. The walls of the old apartment complex groaned under years of neglect, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and peeling paint. Tenants shuffled in and out, their weary faces a reflection of the struggles that came with living under the rule of a ruthless man. The landlord, a towering figure with sharp eyes and a cruel smirk, watched over his property not as a caretaker, but as a king who believed himself untouchable. In the dimly lit hallway, a black worker, known simply as James, carried a heavy toolbox. He had worked in this building for years, fixing leaks, repairing broken doors, patching holes in the walls, always working, always enduring. The tenants respected him, but the landlord, he saw James as nothing more than an expendable servant. James kept his head down, knowing the rules of survival. Do the work, take the insults, and leave without trouble. But today, the air carried a strange weight, something unspoken lingering beneath the surface. "Hey, boy!" The landlord's voice sliced through the hallway like a blade. James stopped, his fingers tightening around the handle of his toolbox. He turned slowly, masking his frustration beneath a carefully neutral expression. "Yes, sir?" The landlord took a step forward, his grin widening as if relishing the moment. "I told you to fix the sink in 3B last night. You take your sweet time, huh?" James kept his voice steady. "I fixed it this morning. The tenant said it's working fine now." The landlord scoffed, shaking his head. "Not fast enough." His tone dripped with condescension. "I don't keep you around to take your time. You do what I say when I say it. That clear?" James swallowed his pride, the familiar burn of injustice settling deep in his chest. But before he could respond, the landlord stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "People like you should be grateful I even let you work here." Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. A few tenants had paused at their doors, their eyes flickering between the two men. No one spoke, but the tension rippled through the air. The landlord, confident in his untouchable position, smirked, believing he had won this exchange as he always did. But what he didn't know was that fate had already begun to shift beneath his feet. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had endured years of mistreatment, swallowed insults, and taken every injustice without a word. But today, something felt different. Today, something was about to change. The walls of the old apartment complex groaned under years of neglect, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and peeling paint. Tenants shuffled in and out, their weary faces a reflection of the struggles that came with living under the rule of a ruthless man. The landlord, a towering figure with sharp eyes and a cruel smirk, watched over his property not as a caretaker, but as a king who believed himself untouchable. In the dimly lit hallway, a black worker, known simply as James, carried a heavy toolbox. He had worked in this building for years, fixing leaks, repairing broken doors, patching holes in the walls, always working, always enduring. The tenants respected him, but the landlord, he saw James as nothing more than an expendable servant. James kept his head down, knowing the rules of survival. Do the work, take the insults, and leave without trouble. But today, the air carried a strange weight, something unspoken lingering beneath the surface. "Hey, boy!" The landlord's voice sliced through the hallway like a blade. James stopped, his fingers tightening around the handle of his toolbox. He turned slowly, masking his frustration beneath a carefully neutral expression. Yes, sir. The landlord took a step forward, his grin widening as if relishing the moment. I told you to fix the sink in 3B last night. You take your sweet time, huh? James kept his voice steady. I fixed it this morning. The tenant said it's working fine now. The landlord scoffed, shaking his head. Not fast enough. His tone dripped with condescension. I don't keep you around to take your time. You do what I say when I say it, that clear? James swallowed his pride, the familiar burn of injustice settling deep in his chest. But before he could respond, the landlord stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. People like you should be grateful I even let you work here. Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. A few tenants had paused at their doors, their eyes flickering between the two men. No one spoke, but the tension rippled through the air. The landlord, confident in his untouchable position, smirked, believing he had won this exchange as he always did. But what he didn't know was that fate had already begun to shift beneath his feet. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had endured years of mistreatment, swallowed insults, and taken every injustice without a word. But today, something felt different. Today, something was about to change. The walls of the old apartment complex groaned under years of neglect, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and peeling paint. Tenants shuffled in and out, their weary faces a reflection of the struggles that came with living under the rule of a ruthless man. The landlord, a towering figure with sharp eyes and a cruel smirk, watched over his property not as a caretaker, but as a king who believed himself untouchable. In the dimly lit hallway, a black worker, known simply as James, carried a heavy toolbox. He had worked in this building for years, fixing leaks, repairing broken doors, patching holes in the walls, always working, always enduring. The tenants respected him, but the landlord. He saw James as nothing more than an expendable servant. James kept his head down, knowing the rules of survival. Do the work, take the insults, and leave without trouble. But today, the air carried a strange weight, something unspoken lingering beneath the surface. "Hey, boy!" The landlord's voice sliced through the hallway like a blade. James stopped, his fingers tightening around the handle of his toolbox. He turned slowly, masking his frustration beneath a carefully neutral expression. "Yes, sir?" The landlord took a step forward, his grin widening as if relishing the moment. "I told you to fix the sink in 3B last night. You take your sweet time, huh?" James kept his voice steady. "I fixed it this morning. The tenant said it's working fine now." The landlord scoffed, shaking his head. "Not fast enough." His tone dripped with condescension. "I don't keep you around to take your time. You do what I say when I say it. That clear?" James swallowed his pride, the familiar burn of injustice settling deep in his chest. But before he could respond, the landlord stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "People like you should be grateful I even let you work here." Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. A few tenants had paused at their doors, their eyes flickering between the two men. No one spoke, but the tension rippled through the air. The landlord, confident in his untouchable position, smirked, believing he had won this exchange as he always did. But what he didn't know was that fate had already begun to shift beneath his feet. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had endured years of mistreatment, swallowed insults, and taken every injustice without a word. But today, something felt different. Today, something was about to change. As James tightened his grip on his toolbox, he felt the weight of years of silence pressing against his chest. He had worked in this building longer than most of the tenants had lived there. He knew every broken pipe, every faulty wire, every weakness in the foundation. And he also knew that he was done letting this man treat him like dirt. The landlord's smug expression remained as he crossed his arms, waiting for James to shrink back, to lower his head and accept the abuse like he always did. But James didn't move. Instead, he let out a slow breath and finally met the landlord's gaze. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've been fixing this place up for years. But you've been breaking it down." The landlord's smirk faltered. James continued, his voice steady. "This building is falling apart because of you. You don't fix things, you don't take care of your tenants, and you treat people like trash. But one thing about neglect? It always catches up with you." A few tenants in the hallway exchanged glances, their interest piqued. James had always been quiet, always kept his head down. But today, he wasn't backing down. The landlord scoffed, his confidence returning. "And what are you going to do about it?" James didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With one click, he played a recording, his own voice, crystal clear. "This building has multiple violations, and the landlord refuses to address them. Tenants are living in unsafe conditions, and every attempt to fix things is met with hostility." The landlord's face paled. James let the recording play, his phone screen glowing with video footage. It showed leaks left unattended, mold growing along ceilings, faulty electrical wires sparking dangerously close to water pipes. It showed the truth. More tenants stepped out of their apartments now, watching the scene unfold. "You think you can treat people however you want because you own this place," James said, his voice unwavering. "Well, you don't own the truth. And the truth is, you've been breaking laws for years." The landlord's hands clenched into fists. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" James tilted his head. "Oh, they already do." And, as if on cue, the sound of sirens echoed from outside. The landlord spun around, his confidence crumbling, as the flashing lights of a city inspector's vehicle filled the street. Someone had reported the building. Someone had exposed the truth. James slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. "Like I said," he murmured, "neglect always catches up with you." As the landlord turned pale, realizing that his power had finally run out, James let out a breath he had been holding for years. He wasn't just the maintenance man anymore. He was the man who had finally brought justice to a place that had long forgotten it. The landlord walked through the halls of his crumbling apartment complex with the air of a man who believed himself untouchable. His leather shoes tapped against the floor, his expensive watch glinting under the dim hallway lights. To him, this building wasn't a home for the people inside. It was just another property, another check deposited into his bank account each month. He didn't care about the peeling paint, the leaky ceilings, or the exposed wires that hung dangerously from the walls. As long as the rent was paid, none of it mattered. For years, he had ruled over the tenants with little regard for their well-being. Complaints were ignored, maintenance requests were tossed aside, and anyone who dared to challenge him was met with threats of eviction. He saw himself as above the people who lived here, especially workers like James, the man who had kept the building standing despite years of neglect. James had been here longer than most of the tenants, working tirelessly to patch up the landlord's mistakes. He had fixed the heating in the dead of winter when the landlord refused to send a repairman. He had replaced broken pipes to keep the apartments from flooding, despite knowing that the landlord would never reimburse him. He had painted over the cracks, secured the broken stair railings, and ensured that people had a safe place to live, even when the man in charge didn't care. James had once believed that his hard work and loyalty might earn him some respect, but over time, he learned the truth. To the landlord, he wasn't a person, just another worker, another disposable figure whose efforts went unnoticed and unappreciated. The disrespect had been constant. James could still remember the first time the landlord had spoken to him with that condescending smirk. "You should be thanking me for letting you stay here," the man had said with a laugh. "People like you don't get chances like this often." At first, James had ignored it. He had brushed off the insults, the dismissive tone, the sneers. He had convinced himself that keeping quiet was the only way to survive. If he did his job and stayed out of the landlord's way, maybe things wouldn't get worse. But they had. With every passing year, the landlord's arrogance grew. He raised the rent without warning. He threatened to evict tenants who complained too loudly. And when James asked for fair pay for the extra work he did, the landlord had laughed in his face. "You don't like it? Then leave," he had said with a shrug. Plenty of people willing to take your place. The building itself had become a reflection of the man who owned it, rotting, broken, and on the verge of collapse. Walls were cracked from years of water damage. The plumbing rattled with every use, and the elevators stalled more often than they worked. The tenants whispered about moving, but most had nowhere else to go. They were trapped, forced to endure a landlord who saw them as nothing more than a steady source of income. James had always done his best to fix what he could, but there were limits to what one man could do. And lately, he had begun to wonder if anything would ever change. As he walked through the halls, toolbox in hand, he glanced up at the ceiling. A large stain spread across it, evidence of yet another leak. He sighed. Another thing to fix, another problem the landlord would pretend not to see. Just as he turned the corner, he heard voices. The landlord was speaking with a tenant, his voice low and threatening. James slowed his steps, his stomach tightening. "I don't care if the heating's out," the landlord snapped. "Figure it out yourself." "But my kids—" "I said I don't care," the landlord interrupted. "If you can't afford to live here, maybe it's time you found somewhere else." James clenched his jaw. It was the same story, the same routine. The landlord's power had gone unchecked for too long. He bullied, he abused, and he got away with it. But something in James had shifted. The weight of years of silence, of swallowed pride, of endless mistreatment pressed down on him. He knew now that staying quiet would not protect him. He knew now that this man had to be stopped. What he didn't know was that the landlord's reign of unchecked cruelty was about to come to an end, sooner than either of them could have ever imagined. The air in the building was thick with tension, the kind that settled in when something had been brewing for far too long. The tenants had learned to move carefully, to avoid the wrath of the landlord who ruled over their lives with unchecked arrogance. But today, something was different. The atmosphere crackled with an unspoken electricity, a sense that things were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. James had had enough. The constant leaks, the failing electrical systems, the broken heating that left tenants freezing in the winter, none of it mattered to the man who collected rent without a second thought. The tenants had pleaded, had asked for the bare minimum, but the landlord had ignored them time and time again. So today, James did what no one else dared to do. He confronted him. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, James tightened his grip on his toolbox as he faced the landlord, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for dismissal. The landlord barely spared him a glance, his usual smirk plastered on his face. "If it's about those leaks again, I don't want to hear it." James squared his shoulders. "It's not just the leaks. It's the heating. It's the roaches. It's the mold in the walls. This building is falling apart, and you refuse to do anything about it." The landlord scoffed, shaking his head as if he found James amusing. "And what do you want me to do about it?" he asked, crossing his arms. "You don't own this building, I do. And as long as I'm getting my rent, it's none of your concern." James clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of not just his own frustration, but that of every tenant who had suffered under this man's rule. People are living in unsafe conditions. You've ignored every complaint, every request for basic repairs. This isn't right. The landlord's smirk faltered. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. His eyes darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You think you can tell me how to run my building?" "I think it's about time someone did," James shot back. That was when everything snapped. The landlord's expression twisted in rage, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Without warning, he lunged forward, his palm striking across James's face with a sharp, echoing slap. The sound reverberated through the hallway, freezing everyone in place. A few tenants had gathered by their doors, watching in stunned silence. James stumbled slightly, the sting of the slap burning against his skin, but he didn't react the way the landlord had expected. There was no fear in his eyes, no submission. Instead, James straightened, lifting his chin as he met the landlord's furious gaze head-on. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. "You can hit me all you want," James said, his voice low but steady, "but you can't hide the truth. People see you for who you are." The landlord's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. He could feel the weight of the eyes watching him, judging him, questioning him. The moment he had struck James, the power dynamic he had so carefully maintained had begun to crumble. He scoffed, shaking his head as if trying to brush off what had just happened. "Get back to work," he muttered, turning on his heel. "And keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." But as he walked away, the uneasy murmur of the tenants filled the hallway. James didn't move. His cheek throbbed, but his mind was clear. The landlord thought this moment would pass, that the fear he had instilled for years would hold strong. But James knew better. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no turning back. Something had shifted, and the landlord would soon learn that actions, no matter how long ignored, always had consequences. The dim hallway of the apartment complex remained eerily silent, long after the landlord stormed off. The sharp sting on James's cheek had dulled, but the weight of the moment still lingered in the air. He glanced around, meeting the eyes of the tenants who had witnessed everything. Some quickly retreated into their apartments, afraid of what might happen if they spoke up. Others stood frozen, uncertain, yet unable to look away. But James knew one thing for certain. This time, the landlord had gone too far. What the landlord didn't know was that James had never been as powerless as he thought. For months, he had been preparing for this. Every insult, every threat, every unjust demand had been carefully documented. He had voice recordings of the landlord's racist remarks, videos of the hazardous conditions that had been ignored, and copies of every ignored maintenance request. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to take down a man like this, but proof had power. James had been waiting for the right moment, and today the landlord had given it to him. A few minutes after the incident, James walked down the hallway, his mind made up. He knocked on the door of an elderly tenant, Mrs. Carter, a woman who had lived in the building for over 20 years. She had seen everything. She had suffered through the same mistreatment, the same disregard for basic human decency. She had been hesitant to speak up before, but now, as she looked at James, she saw something different. "You recorded everything, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. Every last word. Mrs. Carter exhaled as if releasing years of fear in a single breath. "Then it's time." That night, an anonymous email was sent to city officials. The footage of the landlord's abuse, the unsafe conditions of the building, and the blatant violations of housing laws were attached. But that wasn't the only place the truth would be exposed. James made sure the video was uploaded to social media. Within hours, the story began spreading like wildfire. Residents from other buildings owned by the landlord came forward, sharing their own experiences of neglect and mistreatment. The comment section exploded with outrage. People demanded justice, calling for immediate action against the man who had terrorized his tenants for years. By morning, the news had reached local journalists. A reporter arrived at the building, camera in hand, asking tenants for statements. Mrs. Carter spoke first, followed by others who had remained silent for too long. The footage was broadcasted on local news, and soon city officials had no choice but to step in. The landlord, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, walked into the building later that day, as if nothing had happened. He didn't know that tenants were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were standing in their doorways, watching him with a new kind of defiance. He didn't know that his name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Then, the sound of sirens filled the air. James stood near the entrance as two inspectors, accompanied by law enforcement, stepped inside. The landlord's confident smirk faltered as one of the inspectors held up a clipboard. "We've received multiple reports about violations in your properties," the inspector stated, flipping through the pages. "From what we've gathered, you've been knowingly neglecting safety regulations, intimidating tenants, and failing to provide legally required maintenance." The landlord scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is ridiculous. Who filed these complaints?" The inspector glanced at James, then at the growing crowd of tenants. "Everyone." For the first time, the landlord looked uncertain. He turned to James, his face twisting with anger. "You did this," he hissed. "You think you've won?" James met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "No," he said simply. "Justice did." As officials led the landlord out of the building, news cameras captured every moment. The man who had believed himself untouchable now stood exposed, powerless in the face of the very people he had mistreated. And James? James stood tall, knowing that for the first time in years, the truth had finally come to light. James stood in the middle of the apartment complex, no longer just another worker, but a man whose actions had changed everything. The once dilapidated building, filled with whispers of fear and resentment, was now filled with a new energy, hope. The people who had kept their heads down for years were standing taller, no longer afraid of the man who had controlled their lives with an iron grip. The landlord's reign of terror had ended, and James had been the one to bring it down. The moment the authorities had taken over the building, everything started to unravel for the landlord. Inspectors combed through every inch of the property, uncovering years of neglect, unreported safety violations, and illegal rent increases. What was once just the quiet suffering of tenants had now become a full-scale legal case. It wasn't just about the slap he had given James. It was about every injustice he had gotten away with for years. As the news spread, more of the landlord's former tenants came forward. Some had been evicted unfairly. Others had been forced to live in unlivable conditions, their complaints ignored. With every testimony, the case against him grew stronger. The court issued an immediate order freezing his assets, and within days, his name was plastered across newspapers and social media as the embodiment of greed and abuse. For James, the change was both overwhelming and liberating. He had spent so much of his life under the weight of people like the landlord, men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. But now, he realized something powerful. When people stood together, even the most powerful could fall. The community, once fragmented by fear, came together in support of James. Local organizations stepped in to ensure he was compensated for the years of mistreatment. Lawyers took up his case pro bono, fighting for damages that would not only hold the landlord accountable, but also provide James with financial stability for the first time in his life. But the greatest surprise came when a local business owner, a man who had been following James's story, approached him with an offer. "I need someone with your strength, your integrity," the man said. "Not just a worker, but a leader." James hesitated at first. He had never been offered such an opportunity before. But as he looked around at the people who had once shared in his suffering, he realized this was his chance to truly break free. He wasn't just escaping the clutches of one corrupt man. He was stepping into a future where he had control over his own life. Meanwhile, the landlord's life fell apart. His bank accounts drained, his property seized, his name turned into a national disgrace. He tried to fight back, hiring expensive lawyers to clean up his image, but it was too late. The damage had been done. One by one, his properties were stripped away, handed over to new owners who promised to treat tenants with dignity. The man who had once believed himself untouchable was left with nothing. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality that no one is above justice, not even the powerful. James watched as the last remnants of the landlord's empire crumbled. There was no joy in seeing another man fall, but there was justice, and justice was enough. One evening, as James walked through the now renovated complex, he was met with something unexpected: applause. The tenants, the very people who had once been too afraid to speak, stood outside their doors, clapping as he passed. It wasn't a celebration of his victory, but a recognition of his courage. "You did this for all of us," an elderly woman said, stepping forward. "You gave us our dignity back." James nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. He had never seen himself as a hero. He had only wanted what was right. But standing there, surrounded by people who had found their voices because of his actions, he realized something important. He had not just won. He had changed lives. And as he stepped into his new future, he carried with him the knowledge that no matter how powerful someone thought they were, truth would always prevail. James stood at the entrance of the apartment complex, staring at the place that had once felt like a prison. Now, it was something else entirely, a symbol of justice, a reminder that no man, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of his actions forever. The once feared landlord, who had tormented tenants for years, was gone. His empire had crumbled, and the world had finally seen him for who he truly was. But for James, the victory wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about the people who had suffered under him, finally reclaiming their dignity. Injustice had been a constant in James's life. He had learned to endure, to keep his head down, to survive. But this time, he had chosen to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been too afraid to speak. He had never imagined that one act of courage, one refusal to stay silent, could create a ripple effect that would change so many lives. Yet here he was, standing in a place where fear had once ruled, now replaced with hope. The people who had once walked past him without a second thought now greeted him with gratitude. "Because of you, we finally have a voice," one tenant told him. Another elderly woman clasped his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "We never thought we'd see justice. You made it happen." But James didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a man who had reached his breaking point. And in that breaking, he had found a strength he never knew he had. The lesson of his story was clear. Power can only protect the corrupt for so long. No matter how untouchable someone seems, the truth will always find a way to break through. The landlord had spent years believing he was above the rules, that his money and influence would shield him from consequences. But in the end, his own arrogance had been his downfall. This wasn't just a victory for James. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear, for every tenant who had been forced to endure cruelty, for every worker who had been treated as less than human. It was proof that no one had to suffer in silence, that standing up for what was right could truly change the course of history. As James prepared to move forward, leaving his old life behind, he carried this truth with him. He had faced injustice and won, and now he knew he would never be silent again. What do you think this story teaches us about standing up against oppression? Have you ever witnessed an injustice and felt powerless to act? Share your thoughts in the comments below.